My name is Ethan Mercer, and I never imagined that years of building a successful bee farm would be threatened by someone who believed the Homeowners Association could rewrite reality with a few meetings and colorful brochures. What started as a quiet disagreement over a property line turned into one of the most unbelievable neighborhood disasters I've ever experienced. All because one determined HOA president decided my private land would make the perfect public walking trail. Bro, when I first heard their plan, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of joke. It wasn't. They printed maps, scheduled a grand opening, and invited families on a land they had absolutely no right to use. The craziest part, they ignored every warning I gave them about what actually happens when thousands of active honeybees are disturbed. What unfolded over the next 14 minutes completely changed the neighborhood forever, and the fallout was something nobody, especially Karen, could have predicted. By the time all of this happened, I'd spent nearly 15 years building Mercer Ridge apiaries from a neglected stretch of farmland into one of the region's most respected honey producers. My property wasn't some decorative hobby farm with a couple of cute wooden hives sitting near a red barn. It was a fully functioning commercial bee operation with hundreds of active colonies spread across carefully planned sections of land, all positioned to maximize pollination while keeping both the bees and the public safe. Every hive placement had been approved through the proper channels. Every warning sign met local requirements, and every boundary was clearly marked with fences, gates, and bright notices explaining that unauthorized access was prohibited. That's exactly why what happened next still amazes me. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't an honest mistake. It was entitlement mixed with overconfidence. And that combination almost always creates chaos. The neighborhood bordering my eastern fence had been built years after my farm was already established. Anyone who bought a house there knew the apiary existed because the buzzing hives were visible during every property tour, and the sweet smell of blooming wildflowers was part of the area's appeal. In fact, several neighbors regularly stopped by my farm stand to buy fresh honey, beeswax candles, and homemade soaps. Most of them appreciated having local agriculture next door instead of another shopping center. We got along just fine, and I honestly believe the community understood why respecting property boundaries mattered. Then the Homeowners Association elected a new president named Karen Whitmore, and everything changed almost overnight. Karen had a reputation for treating every meeting like she was running a Fortune 500 company instead of managing a quiet suburban neighborhood. She loved committees, glossy presentations, and ambitious improvement projects that sounded fantastic on paper, but ignored basic common sense. According to several neighbors, she constantly talked about increasing property values by making the neighborhood feel more connected to nature. Now, in theory, that sounds reasonable. I like nature more than most people. I literally make my living working alongside it every single day. But appreciating nature doesn't mean you can simply claim someone else's land because it looks peaceful from a distance. Bro, that's the kind of thinking that never ends well. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a cheerful letter tucked into my mailbox. It announced that the HOA was exploring a community wellness walking trail designed to encourage outdoor exercise while highlighting the area's beautiful landscapes. As I kept reading, my stomach dropped. Their proposed map showed the trail entering through a gap beside my eastern fence, winding directly through the edge of my pollination fields, circling one of my largest hive clusters, and exiting near the creek at the back of my property. They hadn't asked for permission. They hadn't contacted me beforehand. They had simply drawn a colorful line across private land, as though ownership was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I immediately attended the next HOA meeting, even though I wasn't a member, because my farm sat outside their subdivision. They allowed me a few minutes to speak, and I calmly explained that the route crossed active agricultural land, containing commercial honeybee colonies. I pointed out that bees generally ignore people who respect their space, but large groups of walkers, bicycles, dogs, strollers, and excited children dramatically increase the chances of defensive behavior if a hive becomes disturbed. I also reminded everyone that insurance, liability laws, and property rights weren't optional suggestions. They're there because situations exactly like this can become dangerous. I honestly thought that would settle the issue. Instead, Karen smiled politely, thanked me for my input, and claimed that modern community planning required compromise from everyone. She insisted the trail would promote environmental education, and even suggested that visitors would enjoy seeing the bees up close. Hearing that nearly made me laugh, except she wasn't joking. She genuinely believed thousands of working honeybees were basically harmless tourist attractions waiting for weekend visitors. That was the moment I realized this wasn't simply about a walking path anymore. It had become a battle between experience and ego, and unfortunately, ego rarely listens until reality forces it to. As the meeting ended, Karen confidently announced that survey markers would soon be placed so construction planning could begin. Walking back to my truck, I had a feeling the situation was heading toward a disaster that no amount of cheerful HOA newsletters would be able to cover up. Over the next several weeks, the situation shifted from frustrating to genuinely unbelievable. Every few days, I noticed something new along the edge of my property. First, it was bright survey flags poking out of grass just inside my fence line. Then, sections of ribbon appeared tied to trees that belonged to me. After that came small wooden stakes with handwritten notes describing future benches, scenic overlooks, and picnic areas. Bro, every time I walked the boundary, I had to remind myself this was actually happening. Someone wasn't just imagining a trail anymore. They were actively planning one on land they didn't own. I removed every marker that had been placed on my property, documented everything with photographs, and sent another certified letter explaining that no permission had been granted for access or construction. The response was complete silence. Then neighbors started mentioning something that caught my attention immediately. Karen had begun promoting the trail at every HOA meeting, calling it the community's biggest improvement project in years. She proudly displayed polished renderings, showing smiling families strolling through blooming wildflowers, while educational signs explained the importance of pollinators. Conveniently, those illustrations showed almost no protective fencing, no warning signs, and certainly no mention of the hundreds of active bee colonies located only a short distance away. That's exactly how entitlement grows. Reality gets replaced with a version that feels better, even if it's completely disconnected from the facts. A few days later, I arrived at my eastern field before sunrise and found fresh footprints cutting through the grass where no one should have been. Someone had even clipped part of the vegetation along the fence, as if they were testing the future route. At that point, I contacted the appropriate local authorities again, updated my documentation, reinforced the gates, and added even more highly visible warning signs stating that the property was an active commercial apiary with restricted access. I wasn't trying to start a fight. I was trying to prevent one. But Karen interpreted every reasonable precaution as proof that I was standing in the way of her vision. Then invitations for the trail's official grand opening started appearing throughout the neighborhood, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, refreshments, and a guided walk scheduled for Saturday morning. Reading that announcement gave me a sinking feeling I couldn't ignore. They weren't treating my warnings as obstacles to respect anymore. They were treating them as background noise. And deep down, I knew reality was about to deliver a lesson that no HOA meeting could vote away. Saturday arrived with perfect weather, and from the edge of my property, I could already see colorful balloons, folding tables, and a crowd gathering near the subdivision entrance. Karen looked absolutely thrilled as volunteers arranged refreshments and handed out printed maps featuring the new community wellness walking trail. The only problem was that the trail still crossed my private bee farm. I had already notified the proper authorities about the planned trespass, locked every authorized access gate, and made sure my warning signs were impossible to miss. There was nothing more I could legally or responsibly do except document everything. Bro, watching people celebrate a path that didn't legally exist felt completely surreal. Instead of turning back when they reached my fence, several volunteers removed temporary barriers they had placed themselves earlier that morning and led the crowd to the opening they had created. 6 families, joggers, bicycles, strollers, and even a few excited dogs poured onto the edge of my pollination fields. At first, nothing happened. Karen smiled confidently, waving everyone forward as though my concerns had been nothing more than dramatic exaggerations. Then the peaceful atmosphere changed in an instant. One unleashed dog sprinted toward a row of wildflowers, knocking over a lightweight equipment stand beside one of the outer hive locations. The sharp vibration rippled through several nearby colonies. Experienced beekeepers know that bees normally remain calm when left undisturbed, but sudden impacts, loud movement, and crowds can trigger defensive behavior. Within moments, the familiar low hum grew noticeably louder. I genuinely couldn't believe how quickly the mood shifted. Parents grabbed their children, cyclists stopped abruptly, and people began realizing that this wasn't a petting zoo or a park. It was an active commercial apiary. The guided walk ended just 14 minutes after it had begun. The crowd retreated in complete panic, abandoning signs, water bottles, and decorations as they hurried back toward the neighborhood entrance. Emergency responders evaluated several people for minor bee stings, and thankfully no life-threatening injuries were reported. Karen's grand opening had collapsed before the ribbon she'd proudly cut had even finished fluttering to the ground, and every warning I'd given suddenly became impossible for anyone to dismiss. The days after the failed grand opening were nothing like the confident speeches Karen had been giving at HOA meetings. Instead of celebrating a new community attraction, the neighborhood found itself answering difficult questions about how the event had been approved in the first place. The documentation I'd carefully collected over several weeks, photographs of the survey markers, copies of my certified letters, records of my warnings, and security footage showing unauthorized entry, painted a timeline that was impossible to argue with. Looking back, I'm incredibly grateful I stayed patient instead of reacting emotionally, because the evidence ended up speaking louder than I ever could. The HOA quietly canceled the walking trail project and removed every reference to it from its newsletters and website. Property owners who had trusted Karen's assurances weren't happy to learn they had been invited onto private agricultural land without permission. Several residents personally apologized after realizing I'd never been trying to keep people away out of selfishness. I was protecting both my business and their safety. That's exactly how real life works. Boundaries often seem inconvenient until people discover why they existed in the first place. As for my bee farm, operations returned to normal surprisingly quickly. The colonies settled down. Honey production continued, and regular customers kept stopping by the farm stand as always. The trail was gone, but the lesson it left behind lingered much longer than any ribbon-cutting ceremony ever could. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unbelievable tales of karma, entitlement, revenge, and real-life consequences. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Ethan's shoes?